And we are live and on the internet, on Facebook. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. My name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And with me today, I have award-winning author Gail Jarrow. Welcome, Gail.
Glad to be here. Good to see you.
So I think you're in store for what promises to be a really exciting conversation. We're going to be talking about her latest book, which you see very helpfully displayed behind her there, Blood and Germs, the Civil War Battle Against Wounds and Disease. It's a fantastic book, beautifully laid out. We're going to talk about it, and I'll flip through it a little bit here, show you some pages. We'll talk about her process and all of that. It's going to be very exciting. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Go ahead and sound off in the comments where you're watching from. See, we already got 36 people on with us. We got Barbara tuning in, one of our longtime fans. I know my mother-in-law is watching from home. That's always exciting. Hope you're doing well, Laura. So while you're tuning in, it helps us greatly if you take some time to like the video. If you like this video and share the video, that helps us a ton in terms of who can stumble across it, who can see it, and it further expands our reach. So that's something simple that anyone who's watching can do, or if you want to heart the video, or any of the other options, react options that Facebook gives you. Those all are immensely helpful. We got Gary from Ellicott City, Maryland, Susan, Fredericksburg, Virginia, Rachel from Bluemont, Virginia, good old John Willen from DC, Marty from Virginia, Dennis from Millville, New Jersey, Jim from Bath, New Hampshire, Caroline from DeKalb, Illinois, Richard from Bridgeport, Virginia, John from Clifton Park, New York, John from Lakeland, Florida, Sherry from White Pine, Tennessee. Oh my goodness. And let's see, Laura Lee from Jackson County, Michigan. So it's, and there's my mother-in-law in Ranson, Jimmy from Gainesville, Georgia. So, I mean, we got a host of people watching with us today from all over the country. Thank you so much for being with us here today. It means a lot. So in addition to liking and sharing the video, another way that you can help us out is by donating to our year-end fundraising campaign. 2020 is almost over, thankfully. And one of the ways we're trying to kind of make up some of the losses we've had this year is with the fundraising campaign. It's called our Hope Through History campaign. I think Jake will drop a link in the comments if he hasn't already. And there it is. We've crossed the $10,000 threshold, which is awesome. Thank you for all those who've donated. And we hope you continue to do so. So again, thanks for tuning in. Please like and share the video. And if you can, donate to our fundraising campaign. It's tax deductible, so that always helps. So with all of that said, I'm going to be talking, for those of you that are just joining us, I'm here today with Gail Jarrow, author of Blood and Germs, the Civil War Battle Against Wounds and Disease. And I want to start off by saying just how much I enjoy the title. In the way that you frame it, the Civil War Battle Against Wounds and Disease. We think about battles as, soldier against soldier. And there's obviously, I mean, of course we do. But I like that you framed it as there is a literal battle being waged against wounds and disease. Talk a little bit about, how you came up with the title, your inspiration for the title, and kind of framing it in that way.
Well, certainly I really do spend a lot of time looking for the right title.
It's an art. It's an art.
Yeah. And I'm really trying to hook the reader, especially somebody who isn't going to just pick up a book about Civil War medicine, because maybe that sounds dry. But I wanted to get the two elements, the blood from the wounds and the germs from the disease, very much part of the Civil War. And the disease part is a part that I wasn't even aware of. It's being as big a deal as it was. I mean, it killed 2/3 of the soldiers that died were from diseases they had. So that's why I wanted both words. And then there has to be a subtitle to help people know that it's about the Civil War.
Hmm. Yes,
And
and your point about the 2/3 died of disease, and further going on this idea of framing it as a battle against germs and disease. The Civil War, we, for all kinds of very good reasons, think about it as a war fought on the battlefield, but in more ways, the Civil War is defined um, by death from disease and sitting in camp and all this sort of stuff. I mean, it doesn't make headlines, but in many ways, not all, but in many ways, that's what defines the Civil War. So to start us off here, I know we've already kind of we jumped in a little bit, but tell us all a little bit about yourself and how you came to be interested in the subject of the Civil War and/or medical history. So how did we get to this wonderful book?
well, my academic background is in biology, and I have written a bunch of books about the history of science, particularly the history of medical science. So I was interested in the Civil War from a historical point of view for a long time, but the medical part I came to actually in doing research for other books I've written. I do a lot of primary source work, and I'd read diaries and memoirs of people who had served, and I kept running across mentions of disease. So one of the books I wrote is called The Poison Eaters, and it's about the founding of the Food and Drug Administration. And the father of the FDA was a man named Harvey Wiley, and he served as a soldier in the war. When I read his diary, he talked about how he showed up at camp and he was only there a few weeks and he came down with measles. I had never thought that measles was an issue. So, it was a big aha moment for me. He was a typical soldier who came from a farm. He was from Indiana, had hardly any contact with anyone outside his community before he went into the war. And like many, many soldiers, he caught one of these diseases like mumps, measles, that people that lived in cities probably already had. Um, I wrote another book called Lincoln's Flying Spies, and that was about the Union Army's spy balloons. And one of the people that I read a lot about was Thaddeus Lowe, who was the head of the Union Army's balloon corps. And in his memoirs, he talked about how he had to leave the Peninsula campaign because he was sick with what sounds like this typhoid fever. And just everything he wrote about that campaign and the disease that was going on then, with a very wet spring in a swampy area, lots of malaria. You had a couple 100,000 men in a small area, terrible sanitation. They had a lot of intestinal problems. That just really woke me up too. And one of the great stories that Thaddeus Lowe told was from Fredericksburg, that he was there in the winter of 1863, kind of waiting around after the Battle of Fredericksburg before Chancellorsville. And occasionally the Confederates would lob a shell across into the Union camps. And Lowe said one time a shell landed in their sewage pit. And a soldier was walking by and he got drenched. Before that, I had never really thought, what did they do about all their sewage? And as it turns out, that's really a key reason there was tons of disease. So all those things kind of really piqued my interest. And I write books about things that I'm curious about. And that's how I put it all together and wrote this book.
Yeah, it's fascinating, the more people I talk to, doing these videos, how, they're working on something else and then they'll just file away these little nuggets that they kind of stumble across that aren't really related to the topic they're working on, and it will eventually lead them to another project. I mean, it's, whenever you dive into any sort of research, historical or otherwise, there's always these little things that crop up on the margins, and friendly piece of advice, pay attention to those because they could lead you somewhere beneficial down the road.
That's the truth.
That's great.
I had decided that I was going to write a series called Medical Fiascos, and this is the first book in that series. And certainly you cannot find a bigger medical fiasco, although many good things came out of it. But you have all these men in small, crowded camps, terrible sanitation, poor nutrition, harsh elements, cold, wet, heat, inadequate clothing, not to mention the war and the ammunition and all of that and injuries, but just from a health standpoint, it truly was a medical fiasco.
And you're touching on something that we kind of struggle to balance here at the museum, um, because you're absolutely correct. The Civil War is one of the greatest medical disasters in our nation's history, or arguably even world history. But that being said, it's also kind of a period of all kinds of hopeful innovation, great things come out of it. It's such a tough balance to strike between emphasizing how awful it was, but also what kind of beneficial things come out of it that are still with us today. How did you try and grapple with that as you wrote the book?
Because my books are mostly marketed to teenagers, I always try to be hopeful. And I guess I just look at everything that way. And every book I've ever written, there's been something positive that I point out. And as I did my research, I learned how much positive came out of the Civil War in terms of the Letterman system, for example, just having ambulances that really worked efficiently, not to mention how all those doctors who came in not knowing very much about surgery and disease came out of the war really knowing a lot, and they took it back to their communities, and it just helped. It helped their communities. It improved healthcare. The nursing, the allowance of women to come into this new profession, that had a huge impact. So I just kept my eye out for any way I could show those positive outcomes.
Yeah, so always important to keep an eye on the positives, and you highlighted a number of really excellent ones there. Now you mentioned that a number of your books are kind of geared towards a younger audience, teenagers, high school, middle school, and all that. Although I think this is appealing for all ages, and I just want to it reminds me of, I think, sort of a glitzier, more digestible version of a book that we use here at the museum quite a bit, Civil War Medicine Challenges and Triumphs by Alfred Bolay. Incredible information in here, not super digestible. It kind of reads like an encyclopedia, which I mean both as a compliment and as a criticism. And I think Blood and Germs here, which if I were to flip through either of these, a lot more images, a lot more kind of helpful headings to point people in the right direction. It's sort of a glitzier, more digestible version of that. It gives you a pretty healthy overview.
I've gotten that kind of feedback from a lot of my books. I do a lot of research, so the information I put in, I really try to be as accurate as possible. But I pick topics that people don't know a lot about. So there have been a number of adults who have told me they've picked up one of my books and they've read it. It's kind of an overview, but gives them good information and familiarizes them with the subject matter. And then if they really get interested, they can look at the bibliography and go on to other books that have more technical or more in-depth information. But that is kind of how my books are. They're an overview, and I like to think a good overview of a topic that somebody might not know much about.
And it comes across. Uh, Now, when you're working, on your books, to talk a little bit about your process. What does it look like, as you're preparing books for a younger audience? Do you approach it differently than if you were to write something geared towards adults, or maybe you don't? Maybe it's pretty much the same process. What does that look like?
Well, what is the same is the research process. As I mentioned, I use a lot of primary sources, and I read books written by experts, and in this case, experts in medicine and in the Civil War history. But the difference is that I'm not going to be writing a 400-page book. So the first problem I have is, what don't I say? I cannot put everything I learned into this book.
Yes,
So I
less is
have to,
more sometimes.
yes. So I think that's the first big problem is, what can I put in? What is going to be the most interesting aspect? And because I'm writing for younger readers, they are not going to be as knowledgeable as somebody you write for, John. When you write an article, you don't have to worry about your readers knowing what typhoid fever is. I do have to worry about that. So my readers aren't going to know the significance of the first battle of Bull Run. They're not going to know what triage means. I have to give a lot of context in my books. So everything I write, I have to develop in that way. I also have to pull in the reader in a way maybe you don't have to do as much with an adult who's already interested in the topic. And one of the ways I do that is trying to personalize, trying to bring in the human story. I have a lot of examples of particular soldiers who've been injured or died, and I have photographs of them in the book. And I've researched as much as I could into the records to find out more about them as individuals, because I think that helps a reader really understand what this was about. It wasn't just numbers, and it wasn't battles and generals. There were individual soldiers that were horribly affected. And then the other thing is the images, because I know this book's going to be heavily illustrated with archival photographs. I have illustrations from the magazines like Harper's Weekly that I try to put on a page that is talking about a certain subject. And the other thing with the images, I was really careful about looking for images of young soldiers. I mean, we know that the majority were youngish, but teenagers. And some of these soldiers were not much older than my audience of middle and high school students. And I put those images in on purpose because I really wanted them to try to identify and think about what it would have been like to be in this war, or at their age, 15, 16, which some of these soldiers were.
Yeah, and those are all fantastic techniques that I think certainly, and not that you were suggesting this, but certainly, you don't have to limit to writing for younger audiences. I think they're tremendously successful at all age levels. I mean, especially the individual stories thing, trying to put a human face to a war that is often talked about in terms of staggering numbers, just because they are so staggering. I mean, it's hard not to bring up the numbers, but yeah, those individual case studies I think are very powerful. They definitely can be. And just to offer a few examples here, I'm going to hold up some pages of the book. Hopefully they come across well on the screen. As you can see, very visually striking here. Just one page over. You got the full page spreads like that. I mean, it's really wonderful. Individual stories here. You have a number of these little text boxes that highlight case studies and things like that. So I think you're very successful in that regard. Now, when putting, you mentioned, you did extensive research. Where do you go to? Both physical facilities, online resources, and you have a very helpful bibliography in the back, and there's all kinds of great suggestions as to where to look. What were some very helpful sources for you that you would point some other people towards?
Of course, your museum.
Yeah, I just I lobbed the ball up for you and you threw it down. Thank you.
Yeah, I did come down to Frederick, and I went to the Pry Museum as well. I went to Washington to the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Museum. I went to several other places in Richmond, Gordonsville, Virginia. I've been to Gettysburg many times because I grew up in southeastern Pennsylvania. So I started going there when I was in grade school.
Right, you couldn't escape even if you wanted to.
Mhm. So certainly going to these places, Antietam, uh, to be there, not only the museums and what they offer, but just physically to be there. When I went to the Pry House, it was so helpful to be in that house and to know that it had been a field hospital in the barn and just the lay of the land. That helps me when I write. Another thing I do, I go into the census records and the pension records, and a source that some people don't realize is really a great source, and that's findagrave.com, where you can, there's photographs of gravestones and sometimes histories of people, and little stories about them. But it's a good place to find dates of birth and death that are probably more accurate than you might find somewhere else because it's on the gravestone. Just anywhere I can find information, I just soak it up.
Yeah,
And then, of course, as I mentioned, then I have the problem of so much information, I have to boil it down.
Yeah, yeah. I remember from my time, well, I mean, I still use it today. I used it quite a bit in graduate school. Find a Grave really is a remarkable resource. I mean, you need to kind of take a few bits of it with a grain of salt, but there's some real gems just kind of lurking, if you know where to look and how to look. So that's a great shout out. I also really appreciate what you said, not just because it involves coming to visit the museum, but I appreciate what you said about the the importance of kind of going to these places to visit. Uh, I've even caught myself thinking, with all, since the pandemic, there's all this really incredible digital programming, and it's awesome. I mean, it's been great to kind of, get insight on other sites, other locations, battlefields. You get to talk with people from around the world. I mean, it's been a blessing for us, but that we should really remember that there's really no substitute for going somewhere and kind of being in a space, especially some of these battlefield sites, field hospitals, things like that, that are out there. There's no real substitute for that, and that when we can go out and go places again, definitely do that and take advantage of it. To the extent that you can. I think that's really important to remember in the world of the pandemic, that there's no substitute, even though there's lots of great digital programming, there's no substitute for going there.
Yes, I agree.
Now let's talk a little bit about the content of the book. As you were doing the research, and you have it, the kind of various, the chapters are topical in the book. Which kind of area surprised you the most as you were doing your research for this?
Well, as I mentioned, the disease part was a surprise to me. I just did not grasp how many diseases and how much of a problem they were. So that part truly was a surprise to me. The other surprise was how many of these soldiers survived horrible injuries. When you see the photographs of their injuries, the amputations, you think, how did they make it in the 1860s? So I think the surgeons were a lot better than I thought they were. And I'm sure that as the war went on, that they got better and better. But that was really a nice surprise to find out. I knew a lot of things, a lot of the myths that people are hung up on about anesthesia, for example. I knew that that was not the case. I knew there was chloroform and ether used. So some of those things were not surprises to me. They might be to other people. But just the amount of success that these doctors had.
Yeah, there's just so many anecdotes, both with via anecdotal evidence or that you find in the case reports in the medical and surgical history. You're reading certain cases, and you're like, oh my goodness, how on earth did this person survive? Especially with the absence of the knowledge of germ theory. I mean, it boggles the mind from time to time. Now, earlier you alluded to the um, uh, importance might not be the right word, the significance, or maybe it is importance, of the role of sewage in the war. And you have a whole chapter in the book titled, I think it's the Tennessee Quick Step, or maybe the Virginia
Yeah,
Quick Step.
Virginia.
Virginia Quick Step. Talk a little bit, and of course, when we get school groups in, especially middle school, the subject of poop is always a popular one. So
Right.
talk a little bit about that and just how significant all of that was.
Well, another book that I wrote was called Fatal Fever, and it was about typhoid fever in the early 1900s. So I was already sensitive about the problem of not dealing with sewage correctly and in a sanitary way. And they certainly didn't. They tried. There were all these rules that the armies put out about how you're supposed to handle latrine pits. But
And I'll just briefly interject there. I remember when I first came across those, that there were Army regulations about that. It's like, why was this such a big problem? I mean, and it was funny to me that their reasoning was more along the lines of, it's good to be clean because that's just what a soldier is supposed to be. It really is not for health benefits. It's more a decorum thing. But it kind of blew my mind. It's like, well, they had regulations. This could have been avoided, if they stuck to those. So that kind of shocked me when I first I just assumed there weren't any for a long time, and then I came across that when I was working here, and that was shocking to me.
well, at that time, people in their own communities didn't have great sanitation. So um, we shouldn't be that shocked that when you have 20,000 men in a small area with a stream going through it, that you're going to end up with some problems. I mean, they just did not put two and two together, which in hindsight, we can do that. But I think that was the problem. And then, they were smelly, horrible places. And a lot of these soldiers just stayed away from the latrine pits and went out behind a bush. So you have all of that going on, which doesn't really help the situation when everybody's doing that. Um, when you put yourself in the place of a soldier actually being in one of these camps and you think about all that was probably really a terrible situation. They probably, well, it wouldn't have been as bad as battle, but it wouldn't have been great.
Decidedly not. Well, and to illustrate that point, the I'm using disease in air quotes here a little bit, but the disease which killed the largest total number is diarrhea and dysentery during the Civil War, somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 deaths combined. And of course, a very, very low mortality rate. We're talking, well over 1 million cases. I mean, basically, if you served in the Civil War, you probably had diarrhea at some point.
And
But
also, this is something else that I came across in research on other subjects. People didn't get over it. I mean, these soldiers would have problems for the rest of their lives with their intestines.
hmm hmm
So I think Letterman was an example of that.
Yeah, I think you're right. A lot of a lot of those issues lingered long after the war, and that's something that we talk a lot about here, and you devote a chapter in the book to. That the Civil War really doesn't end in 1865 for the people that served and fought. Both mentally and medically, it continued long after them and for the rest of their lives. And that's something I think is easy to overlook when we're, as historians, we're using these kind of year demarcations to denote to denote the passage of time and time periods. We got a question in the comments here from Jim. He says, can you comment on how medicine choices changed during the war? I'm thinking particularly of calomel, which included mercury in it. Can you speak to that at all?
Well, Hammond, who was Surgeon General for a while, got in trouble because he didn't want the doctors using calomel because he felt mercury was dangerous. And he was right, but that wasn't the view of the majority. And it got him in big trouble, probably is why he was kicked out as Surgeon General. One of the things I've learned from all of the books I've written in the history of medicine is that change comes slowly and people stick to what they're used to and what they think works. And when new ideas come along, they're reluctant to get on board. So I think there was some of that went on during the Civil War.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point to keep in mind, not just in medicine, but with all kinds of things. When we're presented with information that kind of contradicts the way that we've been doing things, it's, I think, a rare person that says, "Oh my goodness, we were so foolish. I can't believe we were doing it that way. We're going to scratch everything we've ever known and kind of pivot completely and do things a little bit differently." So your point about how medicine changes very slowly over time. To us, it feels like, well, germ theory, once they kind of put that puzzle together, you think it would be a no-brainer that, like, oh, well, we messed up. Let's kind of do it differently. But it's not like a light switch that gets flipped. There's all kinds of debate that happens towards the later portion and after the Civil War about this. Yeah, that's such a great point. The book is, as we've mentioned many times, laid out very well. There's lots of fantastic images in there, and excellent kind of individual stories. I was wondering if you had either a favorite story or image, or one that you thought was particularly illustrative, or ones that you wanted to highlight at all.
Well, you actually showed one that I really like. I'll show it too. It's the one Left for Dead.
Mm.
And I picked this image of this soldier because he looked so young.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, he was only 19 when the photograph was taken. And it shows a wound on his chest. The reason I chose that story was because he's an example of how triage didn't work. This guy was named Judson Spofford. He was from Vermont. He enlisted at the age of 16, lying about his age. Another example of something that did go on quite a bit. And near the end of the war, he was shot in the chest. He was taken to a field hospital. And because he had a chest wound, he was set aside because they couldn't deal with chest wounds. And they figured anybody with one is going to die. So we're going to handle people we can actually save first. So he was set aside, but as he didn't lose consciousness, and as it got chillier at night, he asked a soldier that walked by to take him inside the field hospital so he wouldn't freeze to death. And once he was inside, an attendant washed off his chest, took the blood off of it, and saw that the wound was not that serious. And a surgeon came and took a look. And in fact, what had happened was a mini ball went into his chest, but it went through the skin layers and it lodged in his arm. And the surgeon just made a scalpel cut and took out the bullet. So Judson lived to see another day, even though he was left for dead. I got very interested in this guy, and I looked ahead in the records to find out what happened to him. And he went on to a long life. He was a very successful businessman, and he lived to be 91, and he was buried in Arlington. I also like this story because it was hopeful. It was such a nice ending to a horrible war and to a guy that everybody thought was done for.
Yeah, that's a pretty remarkable story. Yeah, I'm sure not too many soldiers that were shot in the chest in the Civil War can say they lived to 91.
That's right. I have images too of people that were shot in the head
Mm-hmm.
and amazingly survived. And that's another reason I was impressed by some of these surgeons and what they were able to do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There are, and some of them are more, you know, wounds that was kind of a grazing shot, but there's a number of serious head wounds that soldiers survived from. There are a number of instances, a couple hundred instances of trephination during the Civil War. To reduce swelling on the brain, taking a circular piece out of the skull, and we have a number of trephines. It's almost like a corkscrew with kind of a saw on the end. It's a sort of a gruesome instrument, but um, you know before I started working at the museum, I would have assumed that the mortality rate was absurdly high with those sort of procedures. And not to say that it was low, but it was, I say only, it was only about a 70% mortality rate. But conversely, 30% that had a trephination procedure ended up surviving, and some of them ended up living quite long, which I would have assumed that it was like, near 100% mortality rate. So there's some pretty remarkable skill and learning that goes on during the Civil War, just as you say.
And some real
Hmm.
skill.
Absolutely, yeah. We've had a number of physicians that come in, and at various points throughout the museum, we have surgical kits open, and more often than not, and they don't mean this in a pessimistic way, but more so a kind of an astonished way. They'll point at some of the instruments and say, "Oh my goodness, that looks just like what I use on a daily basis." And things like the scalpel. The scalpel hasn't changed, a bit in a couple hundred years, and because it's an effective tool. Um, Let me see here. Going over to the comments, we got a question from Cindy. She says, "Can you comment on the differences in techniques and medical outcomes between the North and the South?"
Mm. Well, no expert, but from everything I read, it sounded as if they were comparable. That there's no solid evidence that I saw that the outcomes were different. I mean, these surgeons were trained in the same way before the war, and I think they had fairly equal success rates, with the exception of the fact that a lot of these Confederate soldiers were not in good shape by the end of the war. I mean, they didn't have food, they didn't have clothing. You know, there were a lot of problems. They were many young and many old because they were running out of soldiers too. So I would think that would have had an effect on survival rates, for example.
Mhm.
John, maybe you know more about this than I.
Yeah, well, I would echo pretty much what you said. They're kind of shockingly similar, based on the evidence that we have. Now, as you mentioned in the book, Confederate medical records are hard to come by. We have meticulous Union medical records in the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. We're almost legally obligated to mention that once every video we do. It's a fantastic source, all freely available online. Great information in there. So we have all kinds of great information there, but unfortunately, and I appreciate that you highlighted this in the timeline in the back of the book. Um, uh, in April of 1865, Richmond burns as the Confederate Army is evacuating, and to the chagrin of historians everywhere, one of the many things that burn are a large portion of the Confederate medical records. So it's hard to say this with absolute certainty, and so I would agree with even the way that you phrased your answer. From what I've read and from the anecdotal evidence that's out there, it's actually kind of remarkably similar in terms of patient outcomes from what we can glean between the North and the South, which I think can be somewhat surprising, for some of the reasons that you just mentioned. as we kind of start to wrap up here, if someone gets a hold of your book, which you can get a copy of Blood and Germs at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine's gift shop, we're closed for the time being until January 15th, and then we'll be open for reservations. So you'll have to wait a little bit to come in and get it, or if you just can't wait, you can email store@civilwarmed.org, and we can make something happen there. But if someone gets a copy of Blood and Germs and they pick it up, what's your hope for the reader when they get the book?
Well, I hope it raises awareness of what went on during the war. I really believe, and this is why I write history, I really believe understanding and knowing about history is beneficial. It helps understand what's going on now. And maybe after you read this and you read about this horrible medical fiasco and everything that happened, but yet there were happy endings and there were good things that came out of it, it does give you some perspective about what we're going through right now with COVID. Horrible year it's been, but at the end of all of this, I think medicine's going to progress. People are going to learn a lot and behave differently, perhaps. And so that's just, I think the overall benefit of Blood and Germs is just coming away with that feeling of optimism of what can happen out of
Mm-hmm.
something terrible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's one of our main taglines here at the museum: hope through history, and that by studying history, very few crises that we face as a society are completely unprecedented. Some of them are, but many and most are not. And this pandemic is certainly not unprecedented. It's certainly not joyous, but by studying the past, there's some comfort to know that we've been through things like this in the past, and that, just as you said, there have been happy endings from the past, and that we'll get through this and other things, and that history offers all kinds of lessons if we pay attention and learn from it. So we echo that wholeheartedly. Before we finally wrap up, you mentioned your medical fiasco series. What's the subject of the next one that's coming? If I don't know if that's too top secret to
No,
reveal.
and actually, it's something that I know Jake Wynn is interested in because
Mm.
I spoke to him about it. It's called Ambushed, and it's about the assassination of James Garfield. And the
Ah.
reason it's a medical fiasco, for people that don't know the story, is that he was shot, but he didn't die for 80 days. And what killed him was massive infection. And his doctors, many of them had been surgeons during the Civil War, and they were still of that mindset. We talk about how change is slow. They were still of that mindset of how you treat injuries, bullet wounds, and they weren't so careful about hygiene. And he did become infected. So the book is about the whole assassination and the build up to it, and a bit of biography about Garfield, but also just how everything happened medically after he was shot.
That ought to be a good one. And when that
It's,
comes out, we'll
yeah,
have to have you back on with Jake. I know it. God bless Jake. He's a great coworker, but he's a man of many very specific fascinations. And the assassination of James Garfield has long been a fascination of Jake's. And Jake, I think I've heard him use this phrase before, that James Garfield, you could argue, is one of the last Civil War casualties. Because in many ways, it's by that point antiquated Civil War medicine techniques that sort of leads to his death. Um, you know, Semantics a little bit, but it's certainly an interesting thought. So you'll have to come back on and talk about that with him then. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you for helping us wrap up 2020, our last live stream of 2020. It's been a great time.
Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year. And let's hope it is a
Yes.
Happy New Year.
That's right. And thank all of you for watching. Don't forget to like and share the video. It helps us greatly the more that you do that. And if you can, donate to our Hope Through History fundraising campaign. There's a link in the comments. That also helps us immensely. So if you can get your tax deductible gifts in by the end of the year, we thank you all greatly from here at the museum. If you missed some of this video, it will continue to live on the Facebook page and eventually the YouTube channel. So you can go back and watch the rest of this and all the other videos we've done throughout 2020. If you're feeling nostalgic for this year for some reason, you can go back and watch some of your favorite videos that we've done throughout the year. We'll be back next on New Year's Day. And when I say we, I mean Jake, talking about medical care at the Battle of Stones River. Should be a good one. So until then, everyone, this is John and Gail signing off.